The river had my throat in its fist, and it would not let go. I had gone under 3 times, and the 3rd time I did not come back up the way a wolf is supposed to, clawing, kicking, furious. I stopped being furious. The cold takes that from you first. The vein in spring flood is a gray wall moving sideways, and it had carried me half a mile from the ford before I understood I was not going to reach either bank, and that the wardstones on both shores were doing exactly what my grandfather had bled to make them do. They were letting the enemy king drown. That is the last clear thought I owned. So this is how it ends. In the water between the 2 banks and no wolf of mine near enough to see. The current rolled me under a 4th time, silt in my eyes, a tree root raking my ribs. My own name going quiet in me, the way a hall goes quiet when the fire dies. Then a hand closed on the collar of my sodden cloak and hauled up. Not gently. There is nothing gentle about pulling a drowning man twice your weight out of a river in spate. It is a fight, and I felt it as a fight, the wrench of it nearly taking my shoulder from its socket. A second grip found my arm. Someone was shouting at me, close, furious in a way I had stopped being. "Breathe, you great fool, breathe, I have you, kick, kick," and my legs remembered how. And the 2 of us thrashed sideways out of the fast water into slower water, into reeds that whipped my face, and my knees found mud. I came up onto the reed island coughing river out of my chest, blind, shaking so hard my teeth cracked together. A hand pounded flat between my shoulder blades. More water came up. Then air, real air, cold and reed green and alive, and with it in the same breath a scent. I want to tell it truly, because everything after turns on it, and I have never once described it right. It was not thunder. My whole life I had been told the fated bond comes like thunder, like a beast waking, like a bell struck in the bone, and I had waited for it through 11 winters as Alpha King and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of duty, and had come to believe the old songs lied. This was the opposite of thunder. This was the river going quiet inside me. All my life there had been a current under everything, the war, the grief, the endless watching of the far bank, a pull I had mistaken for simply being alive. When I breathed her in, the pull stopped. The water in my blood went still, the way the vein goes glass calm in the slack hour between the tides, when even the reeds hold their breath. I had been drowning, and then I was not, and it had nothing to do with air. I got my eyes clear and looked up at the woman who had done it. She was on her knees in the mud beside me, soaked to the bone, dark hair plastered flat, one sleeve of a coarse gray work dress torn to the shoulder from hauling me. Not a warrior, not a Luna in silk. A reed fisher, by the netting callus on her palms and the fish scale sheen on her forearms and the little curved knife still tied at her belt. She was breathing as hard as I was, and glaring at me with the particular disgust of someone who has just risked her life for an idiot. "You crossed the vein in flood," she said. "Nobody crosses the vein in flood. Are you simple?" I could not answer. I was staring at her the way a man stares at the one window in a black house that has a light behind it. "Don't look at me like that. You're gray as a dead thing. Sit up, come on." She got a shoulder under my arm, small and stronger than she had any right to be, and levered me upright against a fallen willow. Then she stopped. She had felt it too. I saw it cross her face like wind over water. Her hand had closed on my bare forearm where the cloak had torn away, and something ran up the length of her, and she went very still, and her eyes came to mine and stayed there wide, and for the space of 3 heartbeats neither of us breathed at all. "What," she whispered, "was that?" "I don't know," I lied, and the lie cost me because I did know I had known since the first breath. But I also knew in that same moment 3 other things that turned the sweetest instant of my life to ash in my mouth. I knew this bank. I knew these reeds. I knew, from the dun and gray dye of her torn dress and the tin fish charm at her throat, exactly whose folk she belonged to. She was Saltmere. She had crossed water no Saltmere wolf could cross and lived, to save a wolf of the Ostwald, and I was not merely a wolf of the Ostwald. I was Corvan, It's Alpha King. I was the man her whole bank had cursed by name every planting since before she was born. I was the thing the Wardstones had been raised to kill. And the river had let her pull me out of it. You should have let me drown, I said. It came out hoarse and cruel, and I hated it even as I spoke it, but it was the truest kindness I had. Do you understand what you've done? Whose bank this is? Girl, go. Get back across before your people or mine come and find you here with your hands on me. Go now. She sat back on her heels. She did not go. She looked at me with a steadiness I would come to know as the whole shape of her. A calm that was not stupidity, and was not fearlessness, but something better than both. A refusal to waste time on panic, while there was still a thing that needed doing. I heard a living creature drowning, she said, and I pulled it out. That's all I've done. I'd do it again if you fell in a second time, which looking at you seems likely. A breath. Now, you've got a fever coming and a river's worth of cold in you, and if I put you back in that current you'll die before you reach either shore. So you'll stay on this island till the tide turns and the flood drops, and then I'll get you to whichever bank you can walk off of. She frowned. Which is which for you? I could have lied again. I did not. I have never been able to lie to her. I found that out on the first hour, and it has held for every hour since. The Ostwald Bank, I said. The far one. I'm from the far one. I watched it land. I watched her understand that the man she had just half-killed herself to save was of the pack her folk had buried sons fighting, and I braced for the recoil, the curse, the scramble backward, the little fish knife coming up. It is what any of mine would have done. It is, God forgive us, what I would have done. She only nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something the weather had already told her. Then it's a good thing, she said. The river doesn't care. The Reed Island sat mid-vein like the back of a sleeping thing, a long low tangle of willow and marsh grass that the flood had not yet swallowed. She built no fire. A fire mid-river between two warbanks is a torch that says here, "Come kill us." But she found a hollow under the leaning willow where the wind couldn't reach, and she stripped my sodden cloak and wrung it and laid it over me, and she sat close enough that the animal heat of her kept the worst of the shaking off. I was too spent to refuse it, and too undone to want to. "Nurries," she said, after a while, without my asking, "in case you're the kind who dies of a fever and I have to tell someone whose lap he stopped in." "Corven," I said. Her hands, mending a snapped strand of her belt net by feel in the dark, went still for just a moment. "Corven is not a common name on either bank. It is a king's name on mine. But she could not have known that the Saltmere do not sing our royal line. They curse it in the general, the Ostwald king, the far bank tyrant, a role more than a man, and after a moment her hands moved again. "Well, Corven," she said, "you owe me a boat. I lost my good punt hauling you in, and it was my father's, and he'll skin me." I laughed. It hurt, my ribs were a ladder of bruises, but it came up out of me unbidden, the first true laugh I could remember in longer than I wanted to count, and it startled us both. In the dark I felt her look at me. "You don't laugh much," she observed. "No. Nor smile, I'd guess." "There hasn't been," I said, "a great deal to smile about." She was quiet a moment. The vain hissed past on both sides, and somewhere upriver a night bird called and got no answer. "My mother used to say," Nurries offered, "that a river takes what it takes and gives what it gives, and it's not for us to keep the ledger. She said it every time we lost a net or a season or a person." A pause. "She's gone now, but I think of it. The river took your good sense today clearly, gave you back your life. Somewhere it's even, if you don't count the ledger." I lay in the dark with the scent of her keeping me anchored to the world, and I thought, I have wardens and wolves and a stone hall and 400 spears, and I have not in 11 years met one soul who spoke to me as if I were simply a wet, cold, frightened man. And she is the enemy, and the river let her cross. That last would not leave me alone. Because I knew the vein. I had studied it the way a man studies the thing that has bled him. My grandfather's grandfather had helped raise the Wardstones after the long drowning, the war that had all but ended both packs, 12 gray standing stones down the length of the border, spelled with the old covenant magic so that no wolf who set foot in the water bearing war in his heart would ever come out of it alive. It was not a wall. It was worse than a wall. It was a judgment. For 6 generations, it had held the peace by killing, and both banks had learned to hate each other across dry throats, never crossing, the war reduced to raids at the fords in the low months when the water ran shallow enough to shame the stones. No Saltmere wolf could cross the deep vein. No Ostwald wolf could either. I had watched it take my own cousin, screaming at 18 on a dare. The stones did not care whose son you were. They took you. They had not taken her. She had walked into the killing river to her waist, to her chest, and hauled a full-grown Ostwald wolf out of the flood, and the wardstones, I had felt them, even drowning, the low humming dread of them like a held note under the water. The wardstones had let her come, had let her go back and forth, had, if anything, gone quiet as she passed, the way the pull in my own blood had gone quiet when I breathed her. "Nurries," I said into the dark, "when you came in after me, did you feel anything, from the stones?" Her mending stopped again. "You know about the stones," she said, "careful now. Everyone on both banks knows about the stones." A long silence, and when she spoke again her voice had changed lower and turned inward, as if she were saying a thing aloud she had never risked saying. "I've never told anyone this. I'd have been called mad or worse. But no, I didn't feel dread. I've gone into the deep vein before, not to cross," she added quickly. "Never to cross, only when a net snags in the channel or a lamb goes in. My father won't, none of them will. They say the stones will take you, and they've never taken me. The deep water goes warm around me, like a hand under my ribs holding me up. I always thought I was fooling myself. A breath. I thought I was fooling myself right up until I walked in after a drowning stranger tonight, and the current parted for me like a gate. I lay very still. I am not a fanciful man. War does not leave much room in a king for wonder. You learn to see the mechanism under the miracle, or you don't survive your counsels. But I lay on that reed island with the enemy's daughter, and the whole shape of a thing I did not yet have words for began to rise up out of the black water of 6 generations, and the hair stood on my arms in a way the cold had not managed. Because there was an old, old song on my bank, not the war songs, an older one, half forgotten, that my grandmother sang under her breath and swatted me for asking about. A song about the woman who had ended the long drowning. Not with spears. She had walked between the 2 packs when they meant to butcher each other on the mud, one small woman between 400 wolves and 400 wolves, and she had bound the peace in her own blood, and the wardstones had been raised on the strength of the covenant she carried, a peace kept thereafter by her line. The river warden, the song called her, and her line, the song said, could pass the water freely, for the covenant knew its own. And her line had ended. Everyone knew her line had ended. That was why the peace had frayed to raids and hate. There was no warden left to renew it, so the stones held it the only way stones can, by drowning. I looked at the woman beside me in the dark, mending her net by feel, calling the river's mercy a fool's fancy, entirely unaware that she had just told the Alpha King of the Ostwald that the deep vein held her up like a hand under her ribs. It didn't end, I thought. The line didn't end. It went to the poorest bank and forgot itself and became a reed fisher who thinks she's fooling herself. I did not say it. God help me. I wanted to seize her by the shoulders and say it. Do you know what you are? Do you know what you could be worth to both our banks? Do you know that you are the answer to a war that has eaten my whole life? But she had risked drowning for a stranger not 2 hours gone, and I would not repay that by making her, in the same night, into a thing wanted by 2 armies. So I held it, and I lay awake watching the reeds while she finally slept sitting up against the willow, and I thought about how a life turns on a single crossed line, and how the river does not keep the ledger, and how it was going to be very, very hard to give her back to the far bank at dawn. The horns came at first gray light. I heard them before she did. My ear is trained to them. the low double note of an Ostwald search horn, upriver and coming down, and under it from the near bank, the answering rattle of a Saltmere watch drum. My people had found where I'd gone into the water. Her people had heard my people. 2 banks were waking, and there was a king missing between them, and a reed island in the middle with the enemy sleeping on it. Nurys came awake all at once, the way people do who have learned that mornings can be dangerous. She heard the horns and the drum, and I watched her map it in a heartbeat. Her folk near, mine near, and herself on open ground mid-river with an Ostwald wolf under her hands, and the tide only now beginning to turn. "That's for you," she said, not a question, the double horn again closer. "Yes. You're not just from the far bank." Her eyes had gone very direct. "Ordinary wolves don't get searched for at dawn with the king's own horns. I've heard that call once in my life. The year they say the Farbank king near died of the wintersick and they hunted the marshes for a marsh herb. That's a king's horn, Corvan." A beat, and something in her went carefully, dangerously still. "Who are you?" The tide was turning. Somewhere off the near bank, a punt was being pushed into the shallows. I could hear the suck of the pole in mud, her folk coming to their watch post, and if they came far enough they would see us, and they would see one of their own reed girls with her hands on the Farbank king, and I did not know which of us they would kill first. I owed her the truth. I had owed it to her all night. I sat up, and the willow light caught my face, and I gave it to her plainly because she had earned plain. "I'm Corvan," I said, "Alpha King of the Ostwald, the Farbank king your folk curse by name. That horn is my wardens searching the river for my body. And you, Nurys of the Saltmere, walked into a river that has drowned wolves for 6 generations, and you carried that king out of it alive." I held her wide, still gaze. "So before your people round that bend and see us, you need to decide, very fast, whether you're the woman who saved a stranger or the woman who saved the enemy. Because those 2 women are going to have very different mornings." The Saltmere pole sucked in the mud again, nearer. A voice carried thin across the water, a man's voice, sharp with the particular fear that curdles into cruelty. "Nurys, Nerys. Where's my punt, girl?" And then the voice stopped, and I knew from the sudden ugly silence of it that whoever it was had just seen us across the reeds. Nurys did not look away from me. In the whole of that terrible dawn, with both her banks waking to war and her own kin's eyes on her back, she looked only at me, and I have never in my life been looked at like that, as if a person were reading me down to the floor of myself and deciding, deliberately, what to do about what she found. "Well," she said quietly, and something in her voice had already chosen, "the river doesn't care whose bank you're from. I don't see why I should be less than the river." And she stood and turned to face her own people, and put herself squarely between them and the fallen enemy king. Her father's name was Hans, and he came across the last of the shallows with a fish spear in his hand and 3 other Saltmere men behind him. And his face was the color of a man who has decided the worst thing he has ever seen must not be true, because if it is true, he does not know how to live in the world it makes. "Step away from him," Hans said. His voice shook. "Nurys, step away and come here, and we'll say you fell in, we'll say he grabbed you, we'll say." "I pulled him out, duh." She said it clearly, so it could not be unsaid. "He was drowning and I went in and pulled him out, and the river let me, and I'd do it again." "That's the Farbank king." One of the men behind Hans, younger, a raid scar down his jaw, had gone the gray-white of pure hate. "That's Corvan. That's the wolf that broke us at the Long Ford. Nurys, that's the you saved that. Do you know how many of ours are in the ground because of him? My brother." "I know your brother, Aldic." Her voice did not rise, but it did not bend either. "I mended his nets after he died. I sat with your mother. I know exactly how many are in the ground on both banks, and I know the river drowns anyone who crosses it hating, and I know it didn't drown me." She let that sit. "Doesn't that make either of you stop for one breath and wonder?" It did not. Hate is faster than wonder. It always gets there first. Aldic came forward with his spear low, and I got my feet under me, bruised, half frozen, a night from death. But I have been a king in a war a long time, and my body knows what to do without asking me. And I stepped up beside her, and let them see what I was even soaked and shaking. If you put that through her to reach me, I said, quite gently, you'll have done what 6 generations of my pack couldn't and killed the one wolf the vein wouldn't. Think about what that means before you do it. Then think about it after. Aldrich stopped. Not from my threat, a Saltmere raider does not stop for an Ostwald threat, but from the thing under it, the thing none of them could look at straight. She had crossed the killing river. They had all watched her walk out of the deep water dragging me, and the Wardstones, which had taken Aldrich's own cousin 2 summers past, had said nothing. And then the far bank answered. My wardens came off the Ostwald shore in a grey wave. I saw Bevan first, my war second, a boulder of a man on a boulder of a horse, and behind him a dozen spears and the double horn going and going. They could not cross the deep channel any more than the Saltmere could, but the flood was dropping and the ford shallows at the island's head were coming clear, and Bevan was already driving his horse into them, roaring my name across the water in a voice cracked open with the fear that his king was a corpse in the reeds. So there we stood, on a shrinking island in the middle of the vein, 4 Saltmere with spears on the near side, a dozen Ostwald spears churning up the ford on the far side, both banks howling, and between them 1 wet reed fisher and 1 wet king, and a peace that had been kept by drowning for 200 years. It could have become the massacre the song remembered. I have thought since how close it came. All it wanted was 1 spear thrown, and it would have all come down into the water, and the stones would have taken whoever crossed in wrath, and the vein would have run red and then run clean the way it always does, keeping no ledger. What stopped it was Nurries. She walked, unhurried, into the middle of the island where both banks could see her, and she raised her empty hands, the netting callous and the fish scale shine catching the grey morning, and she called out over the water in a voice pitched to carry, the voice of someone who has spent her life shouting across open channels. Both of you stop. And to my own men, astonishingly, Ostwald, your king lives, he's here, he's fevered and bruised and he's whole because I walked into the deep vein and carried him out, which none of you can do and none of you will, so unless you'd like to try the crossing in a temper and drown, you'll hold at the ford and let me bring him to the shallows myself. A breath. And Saltmere, put up your spears, because if you kill the far bank king mid-river, the whole Ostwald host comes across the low fords by nightfall and burns us to the reeds, and you know it, and I'll not have my bank die for your pride while there's a cooler thing to do. There was a silence on the vein I had never heard in my life. The horn stopped. The drum stopped. 2 warbanks stood dead still and stared at a reed fisher telling them both, flatly, to behave, and the river hissed between, indifferent, and the mist came off it, and I stood there with my heart doing something in my chest that had nothing to do with fever, watching the woman who had pulled me out of the water pull 2 armies back from the edge of it with nothing but her voice and her wet, calloused, empty hands. River Warden, said the old song in my grandmother's underbreath. 1 small woman between 400 wolves and 400 wolves. She did not know she was doing it. That is the thing I have never been able to make anyone understand. She thought she was just being sensible. Bevan held at the ford, because Bevan is loyal past sense, and I called across that I was well, and that no one was to cross. Hance lowered his spear because his daughter had made the cold arithmetic of it plain, and because, I think, some part of him had always half known his strange girl who talked to the river was not quite the same as other folk. And Nurries took me by the arm, gently now, the animal fury of the rescue all spent, and walked me down to the ford shallows where the water ran thin enough for even a war second to reach, and she handed me across to Bevan's arms like a woman returning a borrowed tool, and she said close, so only I could hear it, "Go and be a king, Corvin. Try not to drown on the way home." And I let her hand go, and it was the hardest thing I had done in 11 years of hard things. And the stillness she had put in my blood tore open again the moment we lost touch. the old current rushing back, the pull, the war, the endless watching, and I understood, sitting slumped against Bevan's saddle as my wardens bore me up the Ostwald bank, that I was not going to be able to leave her on that river. That the leaving had already failed. That some line had been crossed in the night that could not be uncrossed, and it was not the river's line at all. They put me to bed in my own hall with 3 healers and a great deal of hot broth, and for 2 days the fever had me, and in the fever I said her name enough times that Bevan, who has known me since we were pups and fears nothing on this earth except me making a fool of myself, took me aside when I could sit up and said, plainly, "My king, you keep saying a Saltmere name. I know. A woman of the near bank. I know Bevan." He looked at me a long time. Bevan is not clever the way councils are clever, but he is clever the way old dogs are clever, which is better. "She's the one that carried you out," he said. "Through the deep water, past the stones." It was not a question, he had seen it. Every wolf at that fort had seen it. "My king, the whole bank is talking. They're saying a Saltmere Reed girl walked the killing vein. They're frightened. Some of them are frightened of her. And some of them," he hesitated, and Bevan does not hesitate, "some of them are saying that if she can cross, she can lead a war band across, and that we should take her before the Saltmere understand what she is." There it was, the thing I had held all night on the island so as not to make her into it. My own bank had got there in 2 days without me. I got out of the bed. The healers protested. I have never in my life listened to a healer. I stood at the great window of my hall that looks down the whole gray length of the vein to the sea, and I looked at the far bank where a woman I had known for one night was, at that moment, almost certainly being told by her own people the very same thing my people were telling me. "What are you? What could you be used for? Whose weapon are you?" And I felt the pull in my blood swing across the water toward her like a compass needle finding north, and I made the first decision of the rest of my life. "No one takes her," I said. "No one so much as poles a punt toward the near bank without my word. If I hear one wolf of mine has laid a plan to seize the Reed Fisher, I'll have his spear and his name. She is under my protection." Bevan's eyebrows went up into his hair. "Say it to the council in exactly those words, Bevan, under the king's protection, and then find me a way to speak to her that doesn't start a war." "My king, careful, she's Saltmere." "She's the river warden," I said, and it was the first time I had said it aloud, and the saying of it made it true in the room, made it a thing with weight, and Bevan went still the way the whole fort had gone still. The line didn't end, Bevan. It went to the poor bank and forgot itself. The reason the peace is drowning instead of holding is that there's been no warden to renew the covenant in 200 years, and there is one now, mending nets on the Saltmere shore, and she doesn't know it, and both our banks are about to tear her apart to use her. I turned from the window. I'll not let that happen, not to her, not to the last thing that could end this. It took 11 days to reach her, and I reached her the only honest way there was. I sent no war band and no snatch party. I sent a fish. It sounds a small thing. It was the largest thing I have ever risked. There is a channel at the island's head where the reed fishers of both banks work the same water without ever speaking, the one place the war goes quiet because hungry folk have to eat. I had Bevan leave, snagged in the reeds where a Saltmere net would find it, my own signet, the gray wolf of the Ostwald worked in tin, worthless as metal, unmistakable as a message, knotted to a line with a fish traded fairly for it, and one word scratched on a slip of birch bark in my own hand. Island. Slack tide. Alone sea. I did not know if she would come. I did not know if she would bring her father, or Aldic, or a Saltmere spear line. I stood on that reed island at the slack of the tide, alone, unarmed, an alpha king making himself the easiest target of his life, because I could not think of a single other way to say I am not the thing your bank curses, except to walk out onto the killing river with empty hands and wait. She came alone, poling a borrowed punt, in the gray work dress mended at the shoulder where she'd torn it hauling me. She grounded the punt and stepped out and stood there looking at me across the reeds, and the stillness dropped into my blood the moment she was near, the current going glass calm, and I saw her feel it too, her breath catching, her hand rising halfway to her own chest before she made it stop. "You're a fool," she said. "A king standing alone on open water. I could be 4 spears. I could be my whole bank." "You could," I agreed. "You're not. I'd have felt them." And that was true, though I only understood it as I said it, that I knew in my blood that she had come alone, the way you know your own hand is your own. I had to speak to you where no one owns the ground. This island belongs to neither bank. It's the one honest place left on the whole river. She came a few steps closer, wary as a marsh bird, and folded her arms and waited, and I told her. I told her all of it, the old song, the long drowning, the river warden who ended it with her own blood, the line that everyone believed had died out, the covenant that the Wardstones enforced by killing because there was no warden left to renew it. I told her that the deep water held her up like a hand under her ribs because the covenant knew its own, that she had walked the killing vein not because she was lucky or mad, but because she was, by blood she never knew she carried, the one wolf on either bank the river would not take. I told her, last and hardest, that both our banks had already understood some fraction of this, and that both were even now sharpening the same thought, whose weapon is she, and that I had come alone across the water to be the one person on either shore who wanted something from her that was not that. She listened without moving. The tide turned under us and began its slow crawl back up the reeds, and she listened, and when I finished she was quiet a long time, looking at the water, and then she laughed not bitterly, but with a kind of wonder that broke my heart clean in two. "My whole life," she said, "they called me the odd one, the girl who talks to the river. They used to smack me for wading the deep channel after a snagged net. He'd say the stones would take me, and I'd go anyway because I knew they wouldn't, and I could never say how I knew, and I stopped saying it because it frightened people." She looked up at me. "And you're telling me I'm not odd. I'm the last of some peace weaver's blood, and the river's been holding me up my whole life because it's been waiting for me." "Yes. To do what?" And there it was, the question I had come to the middle of a war to answer, and could not, because the answer was terrible and I would not lie to her, and I have never been able to lie to her. "I don't know all of it," I said. "The song's half lost, but the part I know is this. The warden ends the drowning by walking the line herself, in the open, between both packs, and renewing the covenant she carries, turning the stones from a judgment that kills into a promise that holds. She stops it, Nurries, not with spears, with the crossing. That's what your blood is for. That's what it's always been for, and it went asleep in the poorest reed house on the near bank for 200 years, and now it's awake, and both banks can feel it, and if you don't choose what to do with it, they'll choose for you." The slack was gone. The tide was pushing hard now, the punt straining its line, and she looked at it and looked at me, and I saw the whole enormous weight of it settle onto a woman who 11 days ago had only wanted her father's punt back. "And you," she said, "the stillness when you're near. When you touch me," her voice had gone very low. "That's not the covenant, that's a different thing. You know it's a different thing." "Yes," I said, my own voice was not steady. "That's a different thing." "Say what it is." I had held it since the first breath on the first night. I did not hold it any longer. "You're my fated mate," I said. "I'm 200 years war and 11 years a king, and I stopped believing the bond was real, and then a Saltmere reed fisher pulled me out of a river, and I breathed her in, and everything in me that had been pulling my whole life went still. You're the piece of the river, and you're the piece of me, Nurries, and I don't know how to want the one without wanting the other, and I've been trying to give you back to the far bank for 11 days, and I can't do it. I came out here to tell you what you are so you could protect yourself. But the truth under it is that I came because I can't stay away from you, and that's not a king's reason, and it's the only one I've got." The tide roared up the reeds. And she stood there on the island that belonged to neither of us, looking at the enemy king who just laid his whole undefended heart on the mud between us. And the gray light came down, and I watched her decide, again, the way she decided at dawn with her father's spear coming up deliberately, reading me down to the floor, what to do about what she found. "Then I'd better learn what I am," she said at last, quiet and steady and terrifying in her calm. "Both what I am to the river and what I am to you, because I'm not letting either bank use me, Corvin. If I cross that line, I cross it because I chose it." She stepped past me toward her straining punt and paused, close enough that the stillness sang between us, and she looked up. "Meet me here, slack tide. I've spent my life talking to that river. It's time somebody taught me to listen to what it's been saying back." She pulled away into the mist toward the near bank, and I stood alone on the killing river as the tide came up around my boots, and for the first time in 200 years of my line, I was not watching the far bank with dread. I was watching it with hope. We met at the slack tide through the whole of that long spring, and she learned the river the way she did everything, plainly, without fear, giving it more credit than she gave herself. I brought her what my grandmother's underbreath song still held, and the older wolves of my hall dredged up scraps their own grandmothers had swatted them for asking about, and between us, we reassembled a thing 200 years lost. The covenant was not a wall of killing, it had only become one. The warden's blood had bound the two packs into the river itself, so that the vein became the keeper of the peace, and a peace with no living warden to speak for it has only one blunt instrument left, which is to drown the wrathful and let the water run clean. The stones were not cruel. They were bereaved. They had been waiting, the whole time, for a voice that could turn them back from judgment to promise. She learned to hear them. She would wade to her waist at the slack and go still, and I would watch her face change as the deep water warmed around her and told her its 200-year grief, and she would come back to the island shaking and wide-eyed and say things like, "It's tired, Corvin. It's so tired of taking people. It doesn't want to. It's been drowning wolves for 6 generations and it hates it, and it can't stop, because there's been no one to tell it to stop." And I would hold her while she shook, and the stillness would sing between us, and I would think that the world was very strange, that a war I had inherited like a disease could be ended by a woman who felt sorry for a river. But the banks were closing in. You cannot hold 2 war packs still with hope for long. My council fractured, half of them behind me, half of them convinced I had been ensorcelled by a Saltmere witch, and a hard knot of them, led by an old warlord named Garrick who had wanted my crown for a decade, whispering that the warden was a weapon and a weak king was letting her rot on the enemy shore. On the near bank it was worse, because they were poorer and prouder and had buried more. Aldic, the raid-scarred man from the ford, would not let it go, his brother in the ground, and now the far bank king courting the reed girl at slack tide, and to a grief like his the two things could only be one thing. A betrayal, a seduction, the enemy stealing the last strange treasure of the Saltmere. He and Garrick never met. They did not have to. Hate on 2 banks finds the same shape without being introduced. It broke on a gray dawn at the turn of the year, and it broke the way these things always break, with someone deciding to force the crossing before the other side could. Garrick moved first. He did not trust me to use the warden, so he would seize her and use her himself, march a war band to the low fords at the ebb, cross while the shallows shamed the stones, and take her off the Saltmere shore by force, and let the drowning covenant be damned. He took 100 spears in the dark. And the Saltmere watch saw them coming, and the drums went, and Hans and Aldic and every wolf of the near bank came down to the water to die on their own mud, rather than let the far bank take their strange daughter. And so, at the ebb of a gray dawn, 200 years after the long drowning, both packs stood again in arms across the vein, in the exact place the song remembered, ready to do the exact thing the song remembered. And I was a mile upriver in my hall when the horns went, and I did the only thing left to me. I ran. I ran for the water with Bevan and the wolves still loyal to me at my back. Ran knowing I could not cross the deep channel to reach the fords in time. Ran knowing Garrick had a mile's start and 100 spears, and that by the time I reached the ebb fords the killing would have begun. And as I ran, on the near bank in the gray, one small figure was already walking down through the reeds toward the water alone, ahead of her own war line. And I understood what she meant to do, and my heart stopped in my chest. She meant across the line, in the open, between both packs, the way the song said the warden must. She waded in. I have to tell this part carefully, because I was still a quarter-mile off and running, and I saw it across the water the way you see the one thing that matters in a chaos of everything, and I have gone over it every day since. She waded into the deep vein at the full ebb, but the ebb was turning, the flood coming back, the shallows filling, the water rising to her waist, her chest, the killing depth, the place where the stones take you. 100 Ostwald spears on the ford went still. A whole Saltmere line on the near bank cried out, her father's voice above them all, screaming her name. And Nurries of the Saltmere walked out into the middle of the border river that had drowned wolves for 200 years, into water that should have closed over her head and killed her. And she raised her empty hands, and she spoke to the stones. I could not hear the words. No one could, they were for the river, but I saw the wardstones answer. It came up the length of the vein like a light under the water. The 12 gray stones down both banks waking one after another. A low tolling I felt in my teeth from a quarter-mile off. The sound the whole world makes when a thing that has been held wrong for a very long time is finally set right. The killing dread that had lived in that water for 6 generations. I had felt it the night I drowned. Every wolf who ever crossed had felt it, turned over and became something else. Became the thing it had been made to be and forgotten. Not a judgment, a promise. The river stopped being a thing that took and remembered how to be a thing that holds. And the woman standing in the deep channel, waist deep in water that would not close over her, went bright. I will not pretend I understand it. There was a light on her, or in her, moon pale though it was dawn, and it ran off her into the water and down the water to every stone, and the whole vein from the ford to the sea lit gray-silver in the morning like a struck bell made of river, and both war lines, Ostwald and Saltmere, 100 spears and 100 spears, went down onto their knees in the reeds and the mud with a sound like a long breath let out, because you cannot stand in arms in the presence of a thing like that. You simply cannot. I have never been able to describe it, and I have stopped trying. She stood in the killing river and turned it back to peace with her own blood and her own choosing, and 200 years of war knelt down in the water and could not remember, in that moment, what it had been for. Then she swayed. The light guttered. The warden's crossing takes what it takes. I did not know then how much. I only saw her knees go, and she began to sink into the deep channel that had held her up her whole life, the last of her strength spent renewing the covenant, and no one on either kneeling bank could reach her in time. Except that I was already in the water. I had not stopped running. I hit the ford at the head of the island and went in without breaking stride, into the deep vein, the water that had drowned me once, and it did not take me. It held me. Warm around my ribs like a hand, the way she'd always said, because she had just made it so, because the covenant knew its warden and now, through her, it knew her mate. I swam the killing channel that no Ostwald wolf had crossed in 6 generations, and I reached her as she went under, and I got an arm around her and hauled up the way she'd hauled me, ungently. A fight, and her face came out of the water gasping, and her eyes found mine, and the stillness dropped into my blood so hard I nearly went under with the sweetness of it. You crossed the vein, she said, coughing river, half laughing, barely conscious. Nobody crosses the vein. Are you simple? I learned it from a Reed Fisher, I said, and I carried her out. I carried her out onto the island that belonged to neither bank, and I stood in the middle of the shining river with the enemy's daughter in my arms and both packs kneeling in the reeds on either side. And I did the thing a king does, the only thing left to do, the thing the song had been waiting 200 years for someone to do. I turned to the Saltmere bank, to Hans weeping in the mud and Aldic with his spear fallen from his hand, and I said, loud enough to carry the length of the Woken River, "Your daughter has done what all our spears could not. She has ended it. The vein will drown no one now, not yours, not mine. It holds the peace instead of killing for it because she made it so with her own blood." And I turned to my own bank, to Garrick on his knees with his 100 spears, and my voice went cold as the deep channel. "And any wolf of mine who lifts a spear across this water again breaks the peace a warden died halfway to make. Garrick, you march to seize her. Look where you're kneeling. Look what she is. Get up and go home, and thank the river you're alive to be ashamed." He got up. He went home. He was never anything again, not punished, not exiled, simply finished, the way a man is finished when 400 wolves have watched him kneel to the thing he meant to steal. It is a better humbling than any headsman. Aldic I watched longer because Aldic's grief was real and I honor real grief. He knelt in the reeds a long time and then he waded out. The water held him. The water holds everyone now who comes without wrath, and he came to the island, and he looked at Nuri's white and spent in my arms, and he said, "Horse, my brother's in the ground because of your bank." And she opened her eyes and said, "I know, I mended his nets. I'm sorry, Aldic. The river's tired of your brother being in the ground." "So am I." And the hard, raid-scarred man put his face in his hands and wept. And that was the last war death of the vein, a grief finally allowed to just be grief. She was 3 days coming back to herself. The crossing had nearly emptied her, and I did not leave her side, in the reed house on the near bank where her father, weeping, let the enemy king sit at his daughter's bed because the enemy king would not be moved. When she woke fully, she found my hand around hers and the stillness between us and my face, I am told, undone in a way no wolf of my hall had ever seen. "You crossed the deep water for me," she said. "You taught it to let me." "I did, didn't I?" A slow smile, still weak. "Corvin, what happens now to the banks, to us, a Saltmere reed fisher and an Ostwold king?" The smile wavered. "They'll never accept it, 200 years." I had thought about little else for 3 days. "They already have," I said. "They knelt in the water, Nuri's. Both banks together in the same river, and it didn't kill them. You gave them the one thing 200 years of war never could, a morning they were all on their knees for the same reason. They won't forget it, and I'll spend the rest of my reign making sure they can't." I lifted her hand and pressed it to my mouth. "As for us, I'm not asking you to be a Luna in silk in a far bank hall you'd hate. I know what you are. You're the rivers, and you'll never not be. So I'll build where the 2 banks meet. On the island. A hall on the honest ground that belongs to neither of us, where a king of the Ostwold and a warden of the Saltmere can raise a peace that has to be tended, not just kept, because a covenant renewed is a living thing, and living things need someone who loves them near." I looked at her. "Marry me, Nuri's, not to bind the banks, though it'll bind them. Marry me because you pulled me out of a river and I've been still ever since, and I'd like to spend my life being still beside you, and mending nets, and listening to what the water says back." She was quiet a long moment, in the reed house, with her weeping father just outside the door pretending not to listen, and both banks beyond him waiting on the answer that would make or unmake the peace. "The river doesn't keep the ledger," she said. "My mother always said, it takes what it takes and gives what it gives." Her fingers tightened in mine. "It took your good sense that first night, gave you back your life, took 200 years of war off both our banks, and gave me," her voice broke and steadied the way she always steadied, deliberately choosing, "gave me a man who'd cross the killing water the moment I taught it mercy. A breath. Somewhere it's even. Yes, Corvin, I'll marry you on the island that belongs to no one. And I'll spend my life tending the peace, and you, and the river that's tired of taking people." We built the hall on the island, as I said we would, and both banks raised it together, Ostwold hands and Saltmere hands on the same timbers, and the vein held them all in its warm, slack water while they worked. We were married on the honest ground at the slack tide, with her father giving her over and my war second weeping into his beard, and both packs seated on either shore of a river that no longer divided them, only ran between. the way a shared thing runs between two who both love it. I am an old wolf now, telling it. The peace has held every year of my reign, and it will hold past me, because we did not leave it to the stones. We tended it, she and I, and after us our children, who have their mother's ease with deep water and their father's memory of what it cost. The banks intermarry. The fords are for fishing. Aldrich's grandchildren and my grandchildren pull the same channels and squabble over the same nets, and have no idea most days that the water they take for granted was for 200 years a grave. Nuries is beside me still, gray now, mending a net by the fire in our island hall by feel the way she did that first night on the reeds. Sometimes at the slack she still wades out to her waist and goes still and listens, and comes back and tells me the river is content, that it does not take people anymore, that it has forgotten how to want to. And every time she comes back up out of the water, and I feel the old current in my blood go glasscalm at the nearness of her, I think of the night I went under for the 4th time between the two banks, hating. A king the stones had every right to drown, and of the hand that closed on my collar and hauled up, ungently, because there is nothing gentle about pulling a drowning man out of a river. She waded in, nobody crossed the vein, she did, and she has been the still water under my whole life ever since.